So guys, I've just recorded a video on Chris Eubank Jr. and my sort of morning after the night before thoughts on his fight last night with Tom Duran. I'm going to do the same now for Groves and Martin Murray. First and foremost, I guess what I want to say is that on the whole, I believe that last night was a very good performance from George Groves. Yeah, Martin Murray, he's never been a fighter I've truly been on the bandwagon for. I've always felt he was slightly overrated. I always felt he lacked any real offensive capability in terms of world-class offensive attributes. But nevertheless, what I've got to say is that George Groves did a very, very good job on Martin Murray last night. And he won this fight. I think all three judges scored it 118, 110. I had it 117, 111. But yeah, he won this fight in a way that was more dominant than Arthur Abraham did against Murray, and Felix Sturm did against Murray, than Sergio Martinez did against Murray. I mean, the only guy who did a better job on Martin Murray than George Groves last night is Gennady Golovkin. And obviously Golovkin's an exceptionally highly rated fighter. It was a good performance from Groves, and it carried on the blueprints that he had laid out in his two return fights against Andrea De Luisa and David Brophy. And there does seem to be a bit of a McGuigan style that young McGuigan is inputting on his fighters. You know, his fight, especially David Haye and Groves, they seem to be fighting a lot more patiently. They don't seem to be... Groves and Haye will always be very explosive fighters, but they're not coming out trying to throw bombs in round one. You know, you look at what George Groves did to Carl Froch in the first round of their first fight. You don't see Groves necessarily looking to do that anymore. You see him much more trying to feel his way in, trying to box his way in, trying to jab his way in. And Groves has always had an exceptional jab, but the way he's using his jab at the minute, it genuinely is the best jab in British boxing as far as I'm concerned. You know, he is really using it very, very extensively. And I think Groves and his performances have improved substantially. You know, we've got to say the level of opposition is slightly subpar. You know, David Brophy and Andrea De Luisa are much lower level than Groves. Martin Murray is a guy who has consistently fallen at world level. But nevertheless, Groves for me is looking good. You know, issues remain with George Groves. You know, stamina. Look, I'm not saying that after 12 hard-fought rounds, any fighter won't have broken a sweat, but, you know, George Groves was dominant for large periods of last night's fight. You know, as the judges scored it 10 rounds to 2, he was very dominant, and he was able to control the pace for very large portions of the fight last night. You know, Groves was well ahead for extended periods of the fight last night. Yet the stamina still seemed to drain, and when Murray was able to put it on Groves, when he was able to push him back and bring the fight to the inside and have things up close, you saw Groves' stamina drain pretty immediately after that, you know. And for me that was a bit of a concern, because Groves is going to have to be in fights in the future where his stamina is tested more aggressively than Murray tested it last night. Yeah, Murray didn't do anything for the first 3 rounds. He sacrificed the first 3 rounds to George Groves. Groves, for me, I think was 7 rounds up after 8 rounds. I only scored Murray 1 of the first 8 rounds. And I think that was largely because Groves was just so able to dictate the pace and so able to, you know, fight at his own method and really be the ring general in there. So stamina for me is a problem with George Groves. As I've long said, this does appear to be linked to cutting weight. You know, George Groves is very, very big for super middleweight. There was the ludicrous suggestion on the Sky pay-per-view last night that George Groves was actually the shorter man in there. I think they had George Groves listed at 5'11", Murray listed at 6 foot. You know, for me, Murray looked like he was 5'10", and George Groves looked like he was 6'2". I thought the gap between them was vast, and you know, whilst Murray maybe had more obvious muscle mass on him, Groves seemed to have a much bigger frame, you know, bigger shoulders, broader. And, you know, Groves is very, very big, and he is cutting a lot of weight. As you get older, as you know, that becomes more and more difficult. And you wonder if stamina is consistently going to be a problem for George Groves, especially in fights where he has to take more punches to the body than he did last night, especially in fights where the opponent is really going to put it on him from round one. I'll give you an example. Keith Thurman against Sean Porter last night. I expected Sean Porter's assault to wear down Keith Thurman, and I was actually impressed that Keith Thurman was able to fight a 12-round fight. Now, I know it's a different weight class, but if a fighter fought Groves in the manner of which Porter fought Thurman last night, I do not believe Groves' stamina would hold up for 12 rounds. Maybe it's because he's cutting too much weight. Maybe it's just that naturally he doesn't have world-class stamina. I don't know. Maybe it's that he's too explosive. You know, you see him kind of moving a lot. He's feinting a lot. His hands are always moving. Maybe he needs to be a little bit more static when it's not required to be constantly moving. I don't know. But, you know, Groves' stamina, for me, is a real problem going into the big fights. And, you know, if you look at the likes of a James DeGale or a Carl Froch, you know, I know Carl Froch is soundly retired, but it's no surprise that Carl Froch stopped Groves late in both of their fights, because Froch is that sort of guy who's going to grind away for 12 rounds. And you look at a guy like James DeGale, some of the punches he throws to the body, some of the inside work he does, I just question whether George Groves will be able to fight a 12-round fight, because someone with a bit more power and a bit more educated pressure could have caused Groves real problems last night. You know, Murray is a very light puncher, always has been, and, you know, despite the fact Groves won the fight comfortably, there were times where Murray was causing him issues and looking uncomfortable, and making Groves look uncomfortable, should I say. And I just feel that, you know, I would still have big doubts about George Groves fighting at world title level, despite how good he looked last night. I understand potentially his next fight will be against Chudinov. Now, the most memorable, you know, I saw Chudinov fight Sturm, I saw Chudinov fight Buglioni, and both times he impressed me, actually. I think it's Fedor Chudinov, isn't it? Yeah, and both times Fedor Chudinov impressed me. You know, he seemed to have a good engine. He seemed to be a guy who was maybe slightly lacking in world-level skills. I don't think he'd have the skills, and I don't think he'd have the punches from range of George Groves. But Chudinov struck me as a guy who was very tough, very fit, and was capable of bringing a lot of pressure and a lot of heat to an occasion. Now, Groves is a lot classier boxer than Chudinov, don't get me wrong. But that's a fight that isn't a gimme for George Groves whatsoever. This Chudinov is the kind of guy who, for me, stylistically, could cause George Groves a lot of problems. And, you know, for me, George Groves is a, you know, that's one of the reasons he's an interesting fighter to watch, because you never know if there's going to be a bit of a collapse from him. Even if he's 8 rounds up, you know, going into the 10th round, you're not counting your money yet if you bet on George Groves, let's put it that way. So he's an interesting fighter. I've always thought moving to 175 would be really beneficial for Groves in the long run. Having said that, one of the other concerns about him is whether he has a world-class chin, and I wonder if fighting guys who are half a stone heavier, when you've got the likes of Sergei Kovalev, Beterbiev, Adonis Stevenson, who are all known as absolute monster punchers, is sensible. You never know. I mean, it's funny, 168 pounds as a division actually is slightly lacking in terms of world-class punchers. There aren't the biggest punchers in that division if you compare and contrast it with Golovkin and, you know, Lemieux and Andy Lee at middleweight, and, you know, the names I've already mentioned at light heavyweight. So maybe Groves is better off where he is. And, you know, Groves is a very good fighter. He showed a lot of skills last night, but the concerns remain about George Groves. And, you know, he's shown that he can beat the Martin Murrays and the Paul Smiths and the Rebrases of this world. You know, he's shown that he's a bit short at this stage of the Froches and the Badu Jacks. I think it's fascinating to see the level between those guys, and I actually think Chudinov, whilst I understand Groves would maybe be a favourite for that one, I don't think Chudinov's a gimme at all, and I think Chudinov could have the style to cause Groves real problems. Either way, it's going to be a hell of a ride. I'll certainly hope to watch it and, you know, to follow the return of the Saint. Let me know your thoughts, guys. How impressed were you by George Groves last night? How concerned are you about his stamina, his punch resistance, moving up to world level? And who would you pick in, you know, the likes of Groves Chudinov or Groves DeGale? I've got to admit, I need to see a little bit more from George Groves before I pick him against that level of guy. Let me know your thoughts, guys. If you've enjoyed this, do hit the thumbs up button. Leave your comments below whether you agree or disagree. And if you're new to the channel, please hit subscribe. Many thanks indeed for watching.